whenever I talk about ransomware, I do like to give a little bit of a kind of quick journey of ransomware. And part of the reason for that is because this screen in the top left is where a lot of our first kind of experience with ransomware came from, the kind of wanna cry, not petcha type scenarios. Now, these scenarios were pretty significant and devastating to some businesses, but the reason I like to share that one is because there's been quite a journey that's been gone on by ransomware and criminal groups since then, and it's important that we don't set our sights too much on the wanna cry, not petcha, essentially pre-programmed type ransomware, because we've moved into a world of human-operated ransomware, and human-operated ransomware is nasty, because unlike a pre-programmed piece of code, a human can adapt, and they can adapt and work around your controls, your defenses, and that's why it's really devastated businesses. But kind of evolutions of that have taken us to a situation whereby ransomware groups, these criminal gangs, have essentially got franchise models out there, so others can become part of that, their operation, run their own operations, run their own ransomware campaigns. So naturally, as we see that, we're going to see a massive uptick in ransomware cases going on. And underpinning all of this is kind of the initial access brokers, the people who are selling the access to the organisations. Now, this might be part of some of the ransomware groups, it might be completely separate entities, but it's kind of important not to forget that there is an entire business around selling access to an organisation. And once you've bought that access, one thing you might do with that is conduct your ransomware campaigns. Now, the initial access brokers are typically indiscriminate with who they're targeting. And the reason they're indiscriminate is for this very reason. Attackers have landed on a model that allows them to easily monetize their attacks. And kind of if we think about that, if you jump into the shoes of an attacker and you've compromised a bank, for example, we can all picture that a bank's got money in it. If I take money, I can make some money. And money is often the end goal of the adversaries. If you compromise a law firm, for example, how do you turn that into profit? Because you're probably not taking money, you're probably taking data. So to turn that into profit, you've got to have someone to sell it to. So you're not going to target random law firms in the hope that you can find a buyer, because finding a buyer is going to be a tricky task anyway. But in this world, whereby we've got ransomware groups, criminals conducting cyber extortion schemes, well, actually, there's always a buyer. There's the person that you've stolen the data from in the first place. And that's why this trend has become really quite damaging, and it's why it's become very, very prevalent, because it's easy to monetize those attacks regardless of who you target. So whilst there's been a lot that stayed kind of similar, there's also a few other bits and pieces that we've seen going on that are worth kind of delving into a little bit. One theme that we've seen an awful lot of is these criminal groups selling access. So perhaps they've bought the access initially, but they can't do anything with it, so they're selling it on. Or perhaps they've gained the access and actually they've concluded they could be more profitable if they sell it on. So UK Gov, so this crops up on Everest's PR site, I don't know, early this year, selling access to a UK government organisation. And we've seen a lot of these themes. I think Everest was selling access to a US government organisation not too long before as well. So yeah, there's quite a theme going on with this piece. But equally, we've seen an awful lot of infighting within the criminal groups as well, disruption. And I think part of this is as they're bringing in more brokers, more operators, there's going to be disagreements, there's going to be conflicts. One of the big ones we saw is a bunch of leaks from the Conti group. Conti, quite prolific, quite nasty. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, Conti sided with Russia on that, which obviously upset an awful lot of their Ukrainian operators, and we saw a whole bunch of their data leaked, a lot of internal chats, and that gave us quite an interesting insight into the whole Conti operation and actually the sheer size and scale of what's going on there, which was certainly interesting. And I think that sheer size and scale and I guess structure of their operation is one of the reasons that they're one of the groups that have been around for quite a long time. Although it feels like they're on the verge of perhaps shutting down, maybe they'll come out in a reincarnation somewhere else. But another thing that Conti have been involved with, which you may have seen about, is kind of the breach of Costa Rica effectively, which has caused massive disruption to trade and the way that Costa Rica's operating. We've also seen other groups, so Killnet, they threatened Italy and other NATO countries with DDoS attacks and other cyber attacks. And yeah, there's a bit of a theme there. It's not a thing that's happening all the time, but it's concerning. But equally, we've seen a lot of more amateurish groups. Like I flagged Lapsus, you've got Lapsus Stormus, other people cropping up that don't necessarily seem to be in it for the money. And despite me describing them as slightly amateurish, they've actually caused some significant damage. Samsung, Nvidia, fairly big organisations have been compromised off the back of their activities. So regardless of how well tooled they are or how capable they are, they're certainly causing damage. And I expect we'll see an awful lot more of that as well, because the platforms that certainly the ransomware groups have been putting out have enabled a lot more people to get involved. And once they've got their hands on some of this tooling, they're certainly going to take advantage of it and use it. The FBI have been doing their own little battle though. They've taken down a few marketplaces, places where the initial access brokers will be trading access. It kind of feels a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole, but you know what, at least it's something, and it's certainly appreciated. A thing that I'll flag up there as well, because we see it mentioned quite a lot, most recently with Black Basta actually, but we hear ransomware groups are now targeting Linux systems. And actually, the vast majority of that is actually they've retooled slightly so they can hit VMware systems, because a lot of organizations are running VMware for their infrastructure. And in all honesty, yeah, you could hit the file server, or you could hit the virtual machine that's running the file server. One of them is obviously a kind of nicer route. So that's why we're seeing a lot of kind of VMware stuff hit. So some bits and pieces changing, but not quite as radically as we've seen historically. Now, if you were here last time, you'll have seen some graphs that I shared from some data sets that we've been building up and working through at Jumpsec. Numbers around ransomware incidents are notoriously difficult to get accurate and get right, which is why we've taken the approach that we've taken. Like, if you can see in the bottom left, we've got threat post with a post up there saying 80% of victims don't pay up for their ransom. And then Security Magazine, 83% of victims do pay up. So if it was 50-50, I could accept those two stats, but clearly they've taken from different data sets that they're going to be skewed one way or the other. It's really difficult to get accurate data. So for the last couple of years, what we've been doing at Jumpsec is crawling all of the public breach data. So I showed some screenshots of ransomware group sites. In fact, there's a few of them up here as well. We've essentially been crawling them periodically, adding new companies that appear there to our data set, enriching it, cleaning it, because obviously there's no industry standard way to produce a ransomware website. So everything's a little bit custom, a little bit hacky. But over time, we've built a data set of about 6,000 odd entries, which is sizable enough that different SKUs don't necessarily affect it. But we are very mindful that this is only victims who have chosen not to cooperate with the ransomware groups, so have chosen not to pay the ransom. So there may be a particular SKU in that. And we thought it would be kind of interesting to share more of this data with you, share some updates on it. And in all honesty, it's not me that's been doing the hard work, enriching and kind of tidying up that data. Actually, Deepo, who can come up and take you through it, has pulled out a few interesting stats that he wanted to share with you. Now, Deepo joined us a year or so ago from university studying his computer science and security degree. And yeah, one of his key projects has been delving into this data, making it usable, making some sense out of it, and enriching it. So I will hand over to him for a few moments to take you through some of the stuff that he wanted to share with you.
Hi. So one of the things when looking at this project with ransomware trends was to try and see whether ransomware groups are actually targeting particular industry sectors, or whether their attacks are indiscriminate and actually just only affected by the volume of those victims. And I thought it actually would be cool to just see and make sure that the numbers coming out of, for example, Conti, are representative for the UK and not a particular skew of countries. But as you can see, the USA seems to make up the large proportion of ransomware incidents that occur globally. And that's why I decided to focus in on the incidents that occur on UK soil or UK-based businesses specifically. I also thought it would be cool just to see, has ransomware gone up or down in the last 6 months? On this graph, you'll see the red line showing total global incidents, and the blue line showing incidents occurring in the UK only. And for the most part, the UK and the globe tend to track each other, with ransomware incidents dropping by over half, except with the notable rise of incidents around February in the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To look at how industry sectors are being affected, I drew up a graph that shows the number of incidents happening across the UK in different sectors, as well as those respective sectors in the globe. And what was interesting was that it is random targeting, but there appears to be a distribution of them strongly in favor of education, construction, legal, and wholesale trade with regards to the top 10 industries affected in the UK. What you'll also notice, though, is that education is disproportionately affected to some degree to other sectors and to the UK industry sector spread itself. Finally, I wanted to make light of the fact that most of the time in the news, we'll hear of these landmark sums of money being transferred from these really big shot companies. But is that actually the case in the UK? And with the graph showing small businesses in blue, medium in red, and yellow in large, small businesses seem quite heavily affected by ransomware incidents. And it's important to note that with a lot of businesses, they are based on shared service providers who happen to fall into the small category. So consider your businesses and whether you have a number of small service providers helping you along your journey. Thank you, John.
So Deepo mentioned Russia briefly in the dip in his graph, which was an interesting one because around Christmas time, I know I sat there just before Christmas and said to the team, everything feels eerily quiet in the world of ransomware. Like we were genuinely expecting some big incidents to kick off over the Christmas holidays, which fortunately for us, we didn't see them. But perhaps part of it might have been the kind of gradual build up to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Which is something that I know a lot of you guys got in touch with us about. We saw an advisory pushed out from NCSC asking people to make sure that they're building their resilience to possible cyber attacks that might come off the back of it. And the reality is, we've seen some pretty nasty incidents. We saw wiper malware deployed just before the invasion. We've seen satellite infrastructure taken offline, which had some interesting side effects. We saw wind farms being taken out, not because the wind farms had been targeted, but because they were using the satellite connections to feed their data back to the providers. So some interesting side effects. And obviously when sanctions and things were pushed out as well, we saw particular organisations targeted as a result. But for the most part, the organisations that we've seen targeted as a result of this conflict have some form of tie to either Russia, Ukraine, or war generally. But that said, it's certainly no bad thing that people are building their defences, and that can most definitely change over time. We saw the resurgence of Anonymous, who'd been a little bit quiet of late. They've cropped up, supporting Ukraine and targeting Russian businesses. But equally, we've seen the creation of a IT army of Ukraine, which is kind of supported by the Ukrainian digital minister, whose name I can't remember. But ultimately, on a regular basis, they're posting a whole bunch of IP addresses, URLs, hosts, that they're asking their followers to fire denial of service attacks at, essentially. And that, in all honesty, is the vast majority of what we've seen as part of this conflict, is relatively low-skilled attacks, but targeting the disruption of infrastructure. Now, from Ukraine's perspective, they're focused on infrastructure that's sharing news or propaganda that they want to get taken offline, and that's why they're carrying out those attacks. But it's certainly an area to keep an eye on, because obviously the conflict's gone on for a little while now. There'll be an opportunity for Russia to kind of retool and get past some of the challenges that it might have seen from the outset. We have seen a lot of Russian infrastructure kind of geo-fenced from the wider world as well as one of their defensive mechanisms. So it's an interesting one to keep an eye on, but broadly speaking, up until now, the vast majority of the organisations that we've seen having challenges or problems, it's not been necessarily a generic piece. But it has been interesting to watch that fluctuation in certainly ransomware cases from the moment the conflict started. Vulnerabilities. So I imagine many of you spent an interesting Christmas dealing with Log4j stuff. Fun. But we've seen what feels like an awkwardly large number of vulnerabilities cropping up at the moment. And remember I mentioned the initial access brokers. Well, their job is to sell criminal groups access to network systems environments. So this stuff is stuff that they'll be all over. The initial access brokers will be taking these vulnerabilities and trying to turn them into an exploit in order to gain access to networks and then sell that on. So we've seen some really interesting ones lately. For Lena, the Microsoft-related issue, we've started to see that being exploited in the wild. I expect to see more of that being exploited in the wild, particularly through phishing, which will most likely lead to a bunch of new ransomware incidents and other breaches. Log4j, I mentioned, in fact, the UK government piece that I posted a quick snapshot of earlier, we did some digging into that. It's not an incident that we were involved in specifically, but from what we could tell, that looks like that was a Log4j related issue. Anyone who's running F5 products is probably pretty used to that patch cycle now. It seems to be something new relating to their kit every now and then. And I think the crux of it is the way things look, being able to patch these critical vulnerabilities, particularly those on internet-facing systems, is going to be key. It's almost like, I think within a couple of days, for most of these, we're seeing them being actively exploited in the wild. Maybe not at a massive scale to start with, but it's getting there. I'm going to mention ICS, not because I think anything's changed significantly in here, but in the kind of ICS, OT, SCADA type space, we're seeing a lot of noise, a lot of people talking about that now, which I think is a great thing, because I think it's an area that's been overlooked for some time. It's that area that you just, you know what, let's just segment it and keep it in its own place over there, because we're a little bit scared of breaking things. We don't want to touch stuff. And you know what? The engineers over there won't let us touch it anyway. But it is being talked about. I think the NCSC published a report, I don't know, tail end of last year perhaps, talking about Iran and their interest in ICS. And just because it's being talked about, there'll be more people looking at it. Over the coming year, we'll see probably some relatively significant breaches of ICS kit. But one story I did want to share with you as well, as I kind of wrap up, was the UK solicitors firm, Tucker's Solicitors. And on the 24th of August 2020, Tucker's identified a breach in their network, which resulted in a number of their systems becoming unavailable. Now, they'd been hit by May's ransomware. Earlier this year, so in March this year, Tucker's were fined £98,000, so about 1% of their turnover, off the back of this breach. They're fined by the ICO. Now, there's no other cases that I'm aware of where the ICO has fined an organisation off the back of a ransomware breach. So for me, this was kind of an interesting one that I wanted to delve into. Now, 2020 is around the time that, you know what, ransomware is definitely a thing, but it wasn't quite the peaks of 2020. So for me, this kind of begs the question, well, are all those thousands of organisations that have been hit by ransomware since due a fine of 1% of their turnover, or are there specific components to the Tucker's case that made it particularly interesting? Now, I should also comment, neither myself nor Jumpsec were involved in this case at all, but the ICO have written a really good document report on on their findings, the investigation they carried out, and almost the journey that they've gone through. And something else interesting, but probably shouldn't be surprising, is that the fine they've levied Tuckers was not as a result of them having a ransomware incident. It was as a result of them being non-compliant with GDPR from the moment GDPR came into force right up until the point that they had their incident and had to take things offline. So what the ICO have done in this is they've stepped back and gone, well, the only attack path that we care about is that journey to personal data. And there's a whole bunch of other things that I'm sure they could have pulled out and teased out if they wanted to. But they've gone, our focus is personal data. What's the journey to personal data? And have Tuckers done what we feel they should have done in order to protect that personal data? So it's given us a chance to delve into the ICO's mindset a little bit and go, well, what on earth does the ICO expect people to be doing? So it's an interesting one from that perspective, interesting one to delve into. So I pulled a bunch of the data out of the report, which I know it sounds kind of boring, but genuinely give it a read. It's a really good report. And I know there's a little bit of legalese and stuff in there, but actually as a normal human being, I could read it and make some good sense of it. So we start back in 2019. And whilst it's been redacted in the report, it's pretty easy to reverse engineer that it all starts with a Citrix vulnerability. So Citrix vulnerability in their application delivery controller, the Citrix gateway, which kind of took Citrix a little while to fix, but it was a relatively significant vulnerability. Remote code execution scored a 9.8 in CVSS scoring. So it's a shame it took Citrix long to fix it, but in this case, that's actually broadly irrelevant, or probably broadly irrelevant. Fast forward 5 or 6 months, and Tuckers have now patched this vulnerability. So remote code execution, it's taken them 6 months to patch. It wasn't for another 2 months that Tuckers suffered their breach, noticed their systems had been compromised, ransomware took place. They notified ICO, as they're obliged to do, within the 72-hour time frame that they're required to do. Ransomware had encrypted 972,000 files, 24,000 of which related to court bundles, some of which were live court cases that were ongoing at the time. And then a few days after that, Tuckers initiated an investigation, which I asked Matt, our IR guru, who's like, you know what, 3 days is probably a bit long for that in the IR space. But you know what, if you've not got an IR provider, maybe it's going to take 3 days, I don't know, but that could have been quicker in my opinion. September, Tuckers provided the ICO an update, basically saying they've got a new environment, they're kind of back to business as usual, all good. In a slightly awkward moment, I imagine, for Tuckers hit, their data got posted on the Maze ransomware site. And as a result of this, we know that 60 court bundles were taken. We also know that a number of them related to live court cases. It wasn't until after that that Tuckers notified the victims, which kind of tells me something. It tells me that Tuckers probably didn't know what data had been taken. And in a ransomware incident, there's not a one-to-one correlation between data being encrypted and data being taken. Ransomware groups will typically land, take some really sensitive information, and then worry about the encryption afterwards. So there's not a one-to-one relationship. But I had a bit of a chat with some people from the ICO a little while back, because it's a topic that interests me. And a thing that we see an awful lot when people suffer cybersecurity incidents is this statement, there's no evidence of any sensitive data being taken. Well, if you're not logging anything, of course there's no evidence of any sensitive data being taken. And I know this irritates the hell out of the ICO as well, which is probably why in some recent ransomware guidance they put out this statement. If you determine there's no evidence of data exfiltration, the ICO may ask you to demonstrate what logs and measures you used to make this decision. which in my opinion is probably a fairly fair statement. But rewind to a point I mentioned before, ICO very narrowly focused on their specific attack path. They're very focused on that access to personal data piece. So in their mind, you should be logging all access to that personal data. And bear in mind, not for everyone, personal data is their core attack path. There'll be other attack paths you need to worry about, but we're worried about personal data in this case. Come November, Tuckers completely separate from legacy infrastructure and implement MFA across the board. And I think this is a thing that a lot of people who have not suffered a ransomware incident don't quite realise, but recovery isn't an easy thing. You might choose to pay the ransom and get some keys back, and that might decrypt your data, but decrypting data isn't a one-click thing. That takes time. You've probably got to rebuild systems. You certainly can't trust the environment. So for a lot of people, ransomware has been the thing that's helped accelerate their move to the cloud, because suddenly they're rebuilding the entire environment in the cloud. And actually, suddenly a lot of the cost of a ransomware incident isn't fines and things like that. It's actually getting on and rebuilding an environment. Anyway, fast forward to September, Tuckers were issued with a notice that they were going to get a fine. They did reply to ICO and say, but we've installed some additional software, we've got MFA, we've done user training, et cetera, to which the commissioner basically responded and went, but we'd expect you to do that anyway. And there was no change to the fine. The fine was as it stood. And anyway, fast forward to March, a £98,000 fine has got to be paid to the ICO. Now, I mentioned that it was interesting to delve into the ICO's headspace in this. And the ICO pulled out 3 key items that they felt Tuckers had failed at, things that they felt should be in place on that attack path. And none of them look like a surprise, do they? Multi-factor authentication. And Tuckers, if I recall from the report, the ICO didn't suggest Tuckers should have MFA across the board. They suggested that Tuckers should have had MFA on that journey to the personal data. So relate that to your own attack paths. If your attack path is to super secret intellectual property, then MFA on that intellectual property is probably a good journey on that attack path. The insufficient patch management one is an interesting one. Again, it's not a surprise, but it was interesting to see where ICO had taken some of their guidance from, because there wasn't this super special secret criteria that the ICO use. They're drawn from ISO 27001, NIST standards, their own guidance published on their website, same with NCSC. In this case, the SRA, Solicitors Regulatory Authority, and also Cyber Essentials. And in Cyber Essentials, the guidance is patch critical systems within 14 days. So here, their expectation was that Tuckers would be patching critical systems within 14 days in order to prevent someone traversing that attack path. I think it would have been interesting had they been breached in that time period between the vulnerability being identified and Citrix issuing a patch. But you know what? Tuckers gave them a good 6 months. And I don't think, from everything I've read, I don't think Tuckers were particularly targeted. I think Tuckers effectively threw their hat in the ring and made themselves a target by not patching this vulnerability, by not knowing it was there. Final piece that ICO talk about is the encryption of personal data. They felt personal data that Tuckers were holding should be encrypted at rest, which is a fair point. Not that I think that would have had any bearing on the ransomware incident, whether that would have made any difference. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have done. But let's just remember that actually they're focused on that attack path to the personal data. And that attack path could be through someone walking into the server room and taking the disks, for example. So the ICO, again, very narrowly focused on that particular attack path. So it was certainly an interesting kind of insight to draw from this. It was an interesting article, interesting piece to read. But it kind of just reinforced something that I think we mostly already know, is if we know what we look like to adversaries, if we know what our core attack paths are, then actually the controls to put in place to prevent traversal of them are actually relatively simple. And I think over the coming year, we're going to see more of the same. we're going to see some evolutions in the type of attacks that we're seeing. But actually, fundamentally, if we know what we're protecting, best practice is already out there. Thank you for listening.